we need to finish up with inverse functions, which would be the last few exercises on the pink homework sheets for this week. An inverse function is a function that undoes what the original function does. It's the opposite. So if you put an x into the original function and then you put the result through the inverse function, you should get back to where you started. Let's take, for example, the function f of x, which is 8 times x. Then f inverse of x, and this is the notation that we use for writing inverse function. F with a -1, it doesn't mean 1 over x, it means the inverse of the function. If the original function multiplies by 8, then the inverse function does the opposite, the reverse, and it divides by 8. So the inverse function of 8x is x over 8. And you can test that out by putting a value into this. Let's take 5. 5 times 8 is 40. Check it in the inverse, take the 40 and divide by 8, and we get back to 5. So whatever value you start with comes back as x. So you could think of this as f of x, and then you apply the inverse to that, just like we did composition last week. You'll get back to the x that you started with. So the inverse of the function puts you back to where you started. Okay? They undo each other. All right. So I'd like to give you the steps for calculating or figuring out the inverse function. Let me write them down first and then we'll talk our way through. The first thing you want to do is you want to write f of x as a y. So if there's an f of x, change it to a y. Second, you want to switch your x's and your y's. This is going to help us to get the backward function, the reverse, the inverse. So we're going to switch any x to y and any y to x. The third thing you want to do is to solve for the new y. And I say the new y because the new y used to be x, right? We switched it. And fourth of all, you want to write, once you've solved for y and have it by itself, you want to write y as, sorry about that, f inverse of x. Because now the y is the inverse function. You've found the inverse. So these are the steps for finding an inverse function. Let's do an example with an actual function. If f of x is 3x plus 2, we're going to find f inverse of x. Now let's think about this. This function takes the number, multiplies by 3, and then adds 2. So the inverse needs to do it the reverse, the opposite. It needs to subtract 2 and then divide by 3. So this multiplied by 3, then added 2, so the opposite would be subtracting 2 and multiplying by 3. So here, let's follow the steps that we just went over. We take f of x equals 3x plus 2, and we change the x to y. And then next we switch the x's and the y's. We switch them out. This is computing the inverse. Change the y to x and change the x to y. And then we solve for the new y. So we're going to solve this for y. We'll subtract the 2 on both sides. And we'll divide by the 3. And now you'll see we now change the new y to f inverse of x. So x minus 2 over 3 is the inverse function. And that's what we said it was going to do. Instead of adding 2, it subtracts 2. Instead of multiplying by 3, it divides by 3. And you can take a number and test it through. When you put it through here and keep going here, you'll be back to the number that you started with. Okay? All right. That's all you have to do for this section. I might do one more example in a minute.